Again, a big warm welcome from me. My name is Aaron Balick, and I am the director of Stillpoint. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we are a community of psychological clinicians and the psychologically curious. So we find ourselves in the unique position of not being a group of shrinks talking to themselves, but shrinks talking to other people and other people talking to us. And part of that vision is what we are doing this evening. So what we like to do is apply and understand psychological ideas to everyday life. And we are hosting a series of free events coming up over the rest of the summer and early autumn, where we are looking at things that don't necessarily have psychology in the name, but are very psychological in how they work. And if we are doing anything that involves human beings, we can expect that psychology is a very important part of that. Just a little bit of housekeeping as well. We are recording this informal open conversation with G, and it will be on our community and our YouTube page. So if you don't want to be in that video, don't put your camera on, but I can also tell you that we're going to do some Q&A, and then probably about 15 minutes before the end of the hour, I will stop the recording. So those of you who might be a little bit shy to ask questions on the video, you can ask the questions after the video finishes. We also want to make ourselves accessible to all different kinds of people who have different levels of comfort in how they participate. So if you would like to ask G or myself a question, you can just put up your hand, or there's also a way to put up a little digital hand so that we know you're waiting. And if you're a little bit shy about speaking in public, you can also put a note in the chat bar, and I will be reading those questions up to G as we go. So I think most people are here now. Reintroduce myself. I'm Aaron Balick, director of Stillpoint. I'm also a psychotherapist. So my day job, in a sense, is sitting in that consulting room with clients doing psychotherapy. And then the rest of the time I'm doing stuff with Stillpoint, which is exploring our contemporary world from a psychotherapeutic perspective. Really warm welcome to Ji Kim, who we have today, who is an HR consultant. Has been working in industry for quite some time, and then has recently started her own HR consultancy. And I'm going to invite G just to maybe say a few things about herself before I kind of set the tone for the rest of the evening. So hello, G.
Hi, Aaron. Well, thank you so much. Aaron and I were sort of starting our private conversation with, I'm so excited, but obviously a little bit nervous. So it's like this really good feeling to have both. So thank you so much. Everyone's been super welcoming, and I'm really excited to be here. And like Aaron mentioned, yes, I've been doing HR for close to 15 years, obviously in the private sector in-house, and recently during COVID started my own HR consulting company. And I have always sort of been interested in psychology. That has been my undergrad, was my undergrad, got my master's in industrial organizational psychology, and HR was sort of this perfect meld of both psychology and human beings and business. And that's sort of why I entered the HR field. But it's been a great career, and I'm quite privileged for the companies I've worked with, and obviously the clients that I have now. But again, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. And a big warm welcome to you again. Just to let everybody know, the format of these, we call them free open conversations. And what we do is we facilitate conversations with you. So it's not just going to be me talking. It's not just going to be G talking, but I'm going to ask her a few questions to get the ball rolling, to get the energy moving. And then as soon as somebody feels like they would like to chip in, ask a question, start a conversation, let's just go for it. So I'm going to make the opening gambit, G, by broad question. But what would you say would be the biggest psychological challenges and highlights of working? So like psychologically gratifying and psychologically challenging components of working in HR.
Gosh, that's a really good, deep question. So you started with a deep question, which I appreciate. Psychologically rewarding for me is being able to really sort of be that connection between the employee and the employer, and getting employees to a place where you're helping create an environment where there is a lot of safety, where employees can come up and do their best work and operate at the optimal best. And so for me, that is what's more psychologically rewarding, going into an office or going into a client space and seeing everyone feel really safe to interact with each other, to be very transparent, and to just put forth their best work, and have an immense amount of trust amongst one another. To me, there's nothing more rewarding psychologically, and I get like warm fuzzies when I see it, to see people operating within that realm and to have any sort of foothold in assisting creating that, to me, is the most rewarding and why I do what I do. I would say the sort of psychological heavy part of it, obviously, is when you're having employee relations situations, and you sort of obviously try to not get emotionally involved and sort of separate yourself, but it can be hard to do that at times, just because some situations are so emotionally charged, and I'm a human being, and yes, I've been doing this for a really long time, but emotions are emotions, and some things resonate with you more so than others, and those can be a bit trying for me at times emotionally.
Okay, thank you. And I feel like some of these elements are elements that psychological practitioners may also experience in a way, that holding a space for people, also being like having a role to play, having a job to do, but also having your own personal human emotions going on at the same time. And both professions bring a lot of, in our jargon, we would say projection, right? So I wonder what you might say from your experience about the notion of HR in general. Like sometimes when people hear HR, there's an emotional reaction. Maybe employers are scared of it. Maybe employees, I don't know, are drawn to it, or maybe also are scared to it, or think that they're going to be let down by it. It feels like there's a lot of baggage that comes just with those two letters and that role that you take.
For sure. I will say, obviously, I think all of us, when we go to the office space, or office, bring some sort of projections, right? Relationships with our boss or employees, whatnot. HR is interesting in the sense how HR is perceived is going to be based on either the employees or the executives' prior experience. And I've had experiences where an executive, the first day it started, will just say to me, I hate HR. I'm forced to bring you on board because of an investor. And I don't know if this is going to work out. And for me, it's always been sort of a challenge when faced with that, because I know what good HR looks like. And I know when you work with a really good HR professional, that mentality can shift. And so I've had those experiences walking in. And I've also had experiences where executives and employees have had great experiences with HR, and they leverage me in the sense of sort of, okay, we're going to come and build this amazing organization together, executives and employees, and you have a lot more free reign. And so my experience has varied. It's been obviously amazing, but I've walked into situations where employees and executives didn't have great experience, and they really just look at HR as sort of compliance, hiring and firing. And then I've walked into situations where HR is really leveraged for building culture and really helping out with a lot of the coaching with the executives as well.
And I suppose it's quite a handful to manage, in the sense that, probably unlike counseling or psychotherapy, that there is this whole compliance side to HR, which compliance, regulatory stuff, that sits in the lap of highly emotional psychological stuff as well. You're firing, so whatever the process is, hiring someone, firing someone, promoting someone, putting someone on probation, taking them off probation. All of these things are, I don't know if regulatory is the right word, but kind of regulatory and like super emotional.
Yeah, I think a lot of HR is super emotional. You're dealing with human beings. And so it is really emotional, but I think even with the compliance part of it, whether it be a recruiting strategy or process of hiring, or even letting someone go, even developing culture, even addressing employee relations, even coming up and rolling out people programs specific to an organization, all of it is, I think, or can be very highly emotional from my own perspective, just because it impacts so much of the employee and the employee population. And a lot of their experience can also be based upon sort of some of the programs you roll out and how you go about letting someone go or hiring them and the process around that. So for me, obviously you show up and you want to be the best that you can, and but I also realize there are a lot of emotions attached to all these aspects or pieces of HR that is not just about hiring, firing, and compliance.
And I'm going to finish on one, maybe two more questions before I open it up to the floor. But and it's putting you on the spot a little bit, G. But what would you say is your biggest learning through your career up to this point about how to hold that space between the emotional and the compliance part as a human being, as a person who's holding that space?
Yeah, I will say, and we've had discussion about this, I've done a lot of work on myself, like therapy, coaching, all that stuff. Because for me, the biggest lesson I had to learn through my career because of the emotional triggers I had was how I reacted to certain situations and not sort of reacting or showing up the way I wanted to, that I thought was best for the situation. And that was the biggest learning curve for me is, sometimes showing your passion in certain ways isn't the best approach. And I had to get to the root of like, what is it about these situations that are triggering me? What am I projecting? What am I bringing forth? And through my own work, I realized sort of how to remain a bit more steadfast with my reactions because I'm a very passionate person and I, advocate and fight for what I believe in. How you go about doing that for me was a learning curve.
Thank you. It's really, I love doing these talks because you really hear the resonances between professions. Like I always find that people are working in professions where there's a lot of psychological stuff going around. It's like, I can imagine you sitting in a room with someone being subject to the same kind of psychological stuff that I'm sitting in a room with. But I have a language for if someone's projecting stuff or if I'm being seen as what we say, seen as an idealized object or seen as being a bad object, and it kind of helps me sit in that room. And sometimes I feel that people who are doing similar stuff without the capacity to put language on those things are almost at a disadvantage because it sounds like you found your way to the steadfastness to be able to kind of work out how to be in the midst of that. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, really see kind of for me, it's really helpful to feel like, okay, there's a lot of stuff happening in the room right now. I feel like there's a lot of transference, my own and theirs, and that's how I kind of understand the situation. I guess maybe if you don't have that training, but you're doing similar stuff, you just come upon your own language for that. Or maybe I'm underestimating HR and you're actually learning that on the way, how to hold the psychological.
Yeah. And, I think, I do think sort of the more work and the more in tune you are with yourself, which is, and I'm only speaking from my perspective, the more language I've been able to add or the vocabulary I've been able to add from an HR perspective, which is helpful for employees. But when an employee is sitting in front of me and even though I may think, that individual's projecting, I can't necessarily say to that individual, I think you're projecting.
Yeah, the job's a little bit different, right?
The job's a little bit different. And the knowledge may be different for that individual as well. And so my job is always to sort of meet the employee where they're at from a language perspective and an approach perspective.
Great. Okay, I think enough questions from me for now. I wonder if there are people out there, either coming from the more psychological end, the more corporate HR end, who might have a question for G or might have a comment about what's being provoked by this conversation. I also like to make, because it's always a little bit awkward, I like to make an allowance for silence in Zoom sessions. So if people need to digest a little bit, think a little bit about how they want to participate, it's okay if we sit in 20, 25 seconds of silence while we wait for that hand to come up. So I'm going to leave it to you to see who's moved to put up their digital or real hand or bung something in the chat. Okay, we've got a chat here. Hi, G. If your current leader is not emotionally intelligent, what can you do?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. It's a really good question. It's a question that comes up often, and it is something that I have faced often in my career, because I do think there are leaders who are leaders or in that position because they are very technically strong or very good at what they do, but it doesn't necessarily translate to being a great leader or a great motivator. And so my approach, it's always going to depend on the individual at hand, because some individuals are self-aware enough, even though they're not sort of emotionally intelligent, self-aware enough to realize they're not a great leader. Some aren't self-aware enough and they believe they're a good leader. And you can clearly tell from the team members, the feedback, that it's not a great alignment, how that individual operates and how the team would like to be managed or led. And so for me, it's really sort of going in, whether it be, as a consultant or when I'm an employee, really working with the leader to sort of understand, and it takes time, understand how they receive feedback, what is going to resonate with them. And I really want to understand, frankly, if they want to level up their leadership abilities, because some leaders don't. And I like to have those candid conversations or try to gauge that. And so for me, it's a multitude of things. It's working with the leaders, getting to know them, getting trust, understanding sort of how they know themselves, what they know about their leadership skill sets, whether or not they are open to sort of doing work on it. And if they are, we come up with a plan, and I will do focus groups. I'll sort of get feedback from their team and sit down with leader and go over everything, come up with a program. If they're not open to it and they sort of don't want to really make any changes, then we'll sort of come up with alternative ways of sort of how do we mitigate risk to the organization, but also how to ensure that we don't lose team members along the way. But I am one individual who likes to be very open and transparent with everyone that I work with. And for me, the relationship won't be successful if the individual I'm working with don't want to do the work. And so I like to gauge that up front and have those conversations, frankly, because if that's the case, then we need to figure out what's the best approach.
Can I push that a little bit further?
Yeah.
And so you're coming in there with the skills, right? As an HR professional to manage that situation of a leader who's not emotionally intelligent. Can you just maybe say something about managing up? So what if the person who's asking this question, not necessarily the person who's asking it in the chat, but maybe the person who's asking this question doesn't have someone like you nearby to do that work, and they need to manage their unemotionally intelligent boss or manage up some kind of, if I grab something out of the air, maybe their boss is, really disorganized or something like that, something I'm completely unfamiliar with, of course. So, are there any, and I hate to put you on the spot and I love it a little bit, but are there any tips for how subordinates manage upwards?
Yeah, I mean, it's never easy, right? I mean, it's never easy. And I think one, it depends on the comfort level of the individual of having that conversation directly with the leader. I always advise, when employees come to me and they want to have a conversation with their direct manager, whether it be an executive or, just sort of a people manager, I would give the same advice in this situation, which is sort of ask the individual if they're open to feedback. I am very open about sort of sitting down with the individual and just saying, hey, and I would advise this to any employee, hey, I sort of would like to sit down and have a conversation about some of the things that I'm experiencing. Are you open to sort of getting some feedback? And if they say yes, they've welcomed that. It's going to be a lot more transparent, open conversation. If they say no, you kind of know where the situation is at. And so I always advise employees to sort of try to be as transparent and open and with their direct manager or the executive, because that's really the only way to, I think, have one, build trust, and then to be able to figure out very quickly sort of, can the situation get better or not?
Great, thank you. So it takes some emotional intelligence there too, in the person asking for that feedback. Okay, we've got one from Tom here, which is a little bit kind of the reverse of that in some way. In what ways have you dealt with bosses who are avoiding tough conversations with subordinates?
Yeah, that happens often as well. And I always tell the manager this, and it's simple, is giving feedback or what you perceive as tough conversations actually is love. Because, and how I say it is, by withholding feedback or not having that conversation, you're almost allowing someone to flounder because you don't want to step into a difficult conversation. And in our own minds, we're perceiving it as a difficult conversation. But in reality, if you come from a place of care of, I want you to do better, or I want this to happen for you, the mindset and the conversation shifts. So instead of thinking of, this is going to be a negative conversation, this is going to be confrontational, I always advise individuals to say, how can I come from a place of care? Because really why I'm having this conversation is because I want them to do better. And you would only want that for the other person because you cared and you want to see shifts in their behavior or their work. And so when you approach it from that perspective, I do think that your mindset shifts a little bit. And so, yes, this is common. Two, I always say by withholding it, you're actually doing more harm than good. And three, looking at it from a place of care versus a confrontational conversation will actually shift your mindset, the way you approach it, and actually will probably make you a little bit more comfortable with stepping into that conversation.
Thank you. That's, I mean, I would borrow the phrase from our NLP friends, a frame shift, right? So somehow yes. You feel like a hard conversation is a mean thing to do, when in fact, if you shift the frame about what the object of that conversation is, it's like, I know tough love is a terrible expression, but that sometimes that love is delivered with a bit of challenge.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. And if someone is not performing well, or the behavior is sort of sending a certain message, and no one says anything to that individual, and let's say, for example, that individual is let go, and in that exit meeting, that individual is told why, that employee at some point is going to be like, why didn't anybody tell me? And so I always say, when you are giving feedback, you're doing so because you have hopes for that individual to do better.
Thank you. I will invite, we have more questions in the chat, but to mix it up a bit, if anybody does want to put their voice in the room, you can feel free to unmute and put your video on and ask a question. No pressure, of course, but it'd be nice to hear some other voices as well. So I'll just give another couple of seconds of silence, see if somebody wants to do that. And if not, we'll just move on to the next text in the chat bar. Maybe people are waiting until we turn the video off in about 15 minutes time and see how we go. Okay, so I'll go back to the chat, but again, feel free to do this or whatever you need to do to say, to put your voice in there. Understanding that the world is technologically advancing, how can we say that HR evolves for the future, where we might be dealing with AI?
feel like that's like an Elon Musk question or something.
I think I didn't tell them where you're based. You're basically based very near Silicon Valley, aren't you? So it's early morning
Yes,
for you, for
yes,
those of us based in
yes.
Europe. But yeah, maybe an Elon Musk question.
Gosh, it's funny. I have obviously a lot of colleagues who are in the HR world, been doing it for a really long time, and they focus in the tech space. And we talked about this about 2 weeks ago, where we were joking about, can AI ever replace HR? And I don't, I honestly don't think it can. I mean, again, maybe it's because I'm hopeful, but I do think that human beings, human dynamics, are always going to be part of the workforce. And with that, yes, technology is evolving. And yes, a lot of companies moving forward will leverage technology, and AI will probably be able to do a lot of some of the roles in manufacturing or whatnot. But do I ever think that HR can be replaced, or that human relationship, human factor can be replaced? I honestly don't. I think that as technology evolves, as AI evolves, we are going to probably yearn more and more for that human interaction. And so with that, especially in the workplace, I do think HR will be a lot more coveted, because as technology evolves and as AI evolves, I do think that that human sort of connectivity that we're looking for is actually going to increase that desire for it.
I mean, it does have the word human in the title, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
AIR sounds a little bit different, but yeah, I'm gonna hold my tongue on this one, because there are some really interesting, because I think in the therapy world we tend to feel the same. Nothing's going to replace that human relationship. But of all organizations, DARPA, which is like the research arm of the US military, has actually created an AI therapist that can identify all sorts of crazy stuff that humans can, like micro movements in the face and sort of galvanic response in the skin. And it's a little bit creepy. She's also programmed to say in like 17 different ways to build rapport with her clients.
No, and again, it's maybe it can. I am hopeful, and I'm a big believer in technology, but I'm a big advocate of that human interaction, human.
Yeah,
sort of
I don't think you'll find a disagreement from me there.
Yeah.
Okay, Julie, we've got a question from. Hi, G. What would you say is the number? Oh, thank you for waving. Did you want to say it, or you want me to read it out?
I can also say it if you guys want to.
Sure. Please.
I'm currently in the process of stepping foot into HR. I'm trying to shift my career, and I would like to know, my question was, what would be the one thing that you wish someone had told you about working in the field before starting?
A couple of things. One, I wish I learned earlier in my HR career to get a mentor. I sort of waited a little bit longer to do that. And so I wish earlier in my career, just sort of looking back, I had gotten a mentor who was obviously in the HR field and who had been doing it for a while, much sooner in my career. And then the second part, or second answer to your question, is what I wish someone had told me was HR is not a 9 to 5. And so it's not that I assumed it was, but I was often told by a lot of individuals, sort of HR is sort of a 9 to 5. And sort of, once the company is closed, or, it's sort of a work-life balance. And I would say, and maybe it's the companies I picked because of sort of the fact that there's so much going on. I have, worked a lot of hours for each company. And so it was hard for me to balance that work-life balance, because very early on in my career, pre-work, I would say, I was so driven by my career and hyper-focused on it. And I didn't understand how to have that work-life balance. And for me, especially since I was new to the career, in HR, I think I started to burn myself out early on in my career.
That's great advice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other voices that wish to share or something in the chat for us? I think, G, a question that a lot of early career counselors and therapists also have is how people manage to shoulder the responsibility also of the role that, you know, and maybe in some ways more so because in your role there could be direct consequences in work, for example, you know, around whether somebody continues to work or whether someone gets a promotion or not or gets hired or not. Has your relationship with responsibility for the trajectory of somebody else's life, I mean, not that you're fully responsible for that, of course, has that shifted along your time?
You know, it's still heavy. I mean, whether I'm in-house and no matter how experienced I am, and even when I sort of take on clients, I understand my responsibility. As Erin, you mentioned, of course, being a therapist, it's heavy. You have a huge responsibility. And I will say more and more as I've gotten more experienced, not that I've detached, I still obviously feel that responsibility, but I don't internalize it as much. Like or very early on in my career, when I had to exit an employee, it caused me such anxiety leading up to it and after, and I worried about the employee, you know, post departure for a while. And I think it's not that you get desensitized. I think you ultimately realize every behavior has a reaction or a consequence, and sometimes individuals that are in that situation are there because of some of the behaviors that exhibited, and you can't necessarily change the outcome, even if you want to, because everyone has a responsibility and accountability how they should show up at the office. And so for me, I've been able to, it's still a heavy responsibility, it still stays with me, but I've been able to sort of be a bit more logical about the situation and my approach. But it's, you know, to me, letting someone go, it's someone's livelihood. And so I am not one of those HR professionals, just because I've done it many, many a times where I think, oh, I'm so desensitized. I understand what a big responsibility that is. It's just a matter of how I'm able to sort of reallocate some of that energy that I was internalizing before.
Yeah, I'm thinking about those people. I mean, for some people, they make a living out of going in and actually laying off hundreds of people, don't they? And having one conversation after the next, after the next, after the next. It sounds really, and I know that's not what you're doing, but it feels like a very grueling task.
It's a grueling task. Yeah. I mean, I was at a company where we had 3 RIFs, which are reduction in force. And, you know, it was, and I was in charge of having those conversations one after the other, one after the other. And, you know, for me, what gave me peace of mind was I was very adamant up front with the executive that each individual got a very big package. That was in my way comforting myself, because obviously it was a necessity. The business wasn't being funded, and you know, we were in the process of shutting down the company. But I also knew that it was just such a big burden on some of the employees, and so I was very adamant, and the executive was on board, that we offer as much possible in regards to the separation package for each individual. And so as an HR professional, I just try to figure out, like, what are the ways that I can do in these sort of situations to alleviate the blow to the employees? How can I sort of advocate on their behalf?
So I'm afraid I'm going to bring in Freud a little bit here, because you know, because it's HR, so of course there would be a little bit of Freud. But what's interesting about Freud is he talks, you know, he basically conceives of the whole psychic system based on how one manages their internal world and what he calls the reality principle, and all of the compromises that we make and all of the defenses that we have about the reality of things. And I think part of my trajectory, in a sense of having been a therapist mostly and then kind of running an organization, is that in any organization, you hit the reality principle very quickly, right? Because it's about resources, it's about human relationships, it's about organization. So before I turn off the record and invite people to maybe feel a bit more free about participating, I guess I wanted to ask you kind of a cultural question, because sometimes when you're working as a counselor or psychotherapist and people are reporting to you about their lives in work, it can seem like that work is a bad culture, right? Like I've worked with people who've been like in the banking industry in central London, and it's just like, well, there's no way to like, there's no way that environment sounds like it's going to be okay for you. What I'm hearing, it's just like, it just sounds like a brutal environment, and you have to decide whether you feel you can adapt to that brutal environment, the brutality of that environment or not. Is it for you? So I wonder if you've learned anything, and I don't mean like in a heavily political way, but just about capitalism and how capitalism manifests itself in a business that has a reality principle that's very challenging. Just 9 to 5 days a week is very challenging. Like you said, you burnt out yourself, that there's something about the culture that can feel very hard to sit with comfortably.
Yeah. So Erin, clarify sort of your question, just so
yeah,
I
sorry,
know
I tend to go
it.
on a bit.
No. I just wanted to be.
Yeah. Have you noticed, I guess, the edges of like, have you learned anything about we're all coming from different cultures, but sort of like about work culture that comes to mind? That just almost like demand that makes the role impossible, I would imagine at times, because there's limited resources. People can't stay in a job forever. People need to retire at some point. It's just like, I don't know. The word that strikes me is just the unfairness of a maybe dog eat dog component of business life in general.
Yeah, and I don't know, and I'll start, and then if I'm not sort of answering your question, let me know, and then we could sort of pivot. But I've been in different industries. I've been in professional services, financial services. I've been in the tech space, and which are very, for profit, very much sort of business oriented industries. And for me, I learned very on that those specific industries, there's no off. And that's why I would say maybe it's the companies or the industry I picked. When the executives are on, or when the employees are on in those industries, they tend to be on a lot. And so I was having 10 p.m. meetings. I was, having, 6 a.m. calls. And so there are very specific industries that walking in, owning HR, they operate from a culture a very specific way. What I will say is I was very much adamant early on in my career that, yes, these are the industries I'm going to work in, but I wanted to make sure, and again, they're going to have very specific cultures. It's just going to be the norm. But for me, it was within that culture, within that norm, finding the right executives to work with, because you could be very capitalistic for profit, but you can also have, as an executive, as leaders, a perspective of, I want to do right by the employees. And I've been very fortunate in my career that, yes, the industries that I've been with can be a bit cutthroat, but the companies I've been with, and executives I've chosen to work with, have come from a place where their values very much align with mine. And so that was something that was very important to me. And that is something that I was not, that I wasn't willing to waver on. And so I think my experience has been a bit different, just because I've been with maybe smaller, mid-sized companies, not the big banks or big financial services. And then secondly, knowing the executives and sort of what their beliefs are, what their values are, I could align with that. Maybe not 100%, but a high percentage wise. And so that enabled me to do my job and believe in what I was doing.
Thank you. I've got another question here in the chat, and after I ask this one, I'll take the recording off. Not everyone feels HR management is a worthy investment. What can one do if they lose their opportunities to such attitudes?
Gosh, yeah, I've been in rooms where it's literally HR is just an overhead. We don't bring in net revenue, and and it's sort of and HR has sort of been seen that way. It's an overhead, and again, like I said early on in our conversation, depends on the company, their experience with HR. I always argue with executives when there's a viewpoint of that point, which is less tangible, but HR has such an impact on even turnover. If you sort of look at turnover, the cost it is associated with turnover, meaning how much it costs to hire someone, the time spent. Once an individual leaves, the knowledge that walks out that door. I sort of have been one who, yes, likes to sort of have the emotional component of it, but I'm a very technical person in the sense of I like a lot of numbers. And so sometimes when there has been sort of this waiver of what HR can bring, or one doesn't truly understand, I like to put some numbers around that, right? And so sometimes when I walk into an organization, or I'm starting to work with a new client, I like to start putting numbers together for them. And so I'll start looking at turnover. I'll look at, I may roll out sort of an analytical survey on employee satisfaction, engagement, see where they're at. And then based on the programs I roll out, we'll resurvey to look at where the numbers are to show there is a tangible number associated with employee happiness, productivity, and sort of mitigating risk. And so sometimes when there has been this loss of confidence or this lack of understanding of what HR can bring, that's when I start putting a lot of numbers into play, just because I think sometimes numbers can convince people otherwise.
So a little bit of evidence based there to show the return on investment, right?